My apologies. We'll try that again. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. We're very fortunate to have Judy Bendich from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, here to talk with us today about some of the current issues surrounding the criminal justice system. Judy is a retired attorney from Bendich, Stobaugh, and Strong, whose work involved large class action lawsuits on behalf of employees called permatemps. These are temporary employees, like on-call consultants, agency employees, contract workers, and part-time workers who are functionally the same as regular employees but denied the same pay and benefits as regular employees. She has an outstanding record of volunteer work with the ACLU, which includes president of the Washington State Affiliate from 1979 to 1982, affiliate representative to the National Board, and at-large ACLU National Board member from 1983 to present. She has served on many ACLU committees, among them the Church-State Committee, and 10 years service on the National ACLU's Executive Committee. The criminal justice system affects all of us, with far-reaching implications in society. Things like the punitive justice system and state-sanctioned executions speak to what kind of people we want to be as a society. These are very important issues indeed. Let's show Judy our appreciation for taking the time to come talk about them with us today.
I may stand up because this is a little broader than I thought. But I thank you for having me here today. I've spoken to the atheists before, but on church-state stuff. So when I got the call from the ACLU local office to say, would you be a speaker? I said, sure. And then I talked with George, and George said, no, we don't want to hear about that. So I gave him kind of a laundry list of topics on ACLU work, which spans the civil liberties and civil rights agenda. And he said, oh, criminal law sounds good. So I'm going to talk to you today about criminal law, but not necessarily in the way that you think. And so really I'm going to focus on race in criminal law today, because this is a topic that makes a lot of people in this country feel uncomfortable, or they deny it, or they take a look at Obama and say we don't have a problem anymore. But it truly, to me, permeates this society. And it is the primary basis of close to 50% of those people incarcerated today in our federal prisons. And it's not through happenstance. It is a part of a deliberate, racist set of policies. Now that's a very, very, very strong statement. I happen to have in the audience somebody who's read Michelle Alexander's book on race in the prison system, and I may call on David later to talk a little bit about it. But it's coming to, the focus of today's talk is going to be on two issues, and I really consider this a talk. I really would hope we have a dialogue in the room about this, and that if you have questions or want to challenge me or whatever, that's really a welcome thing. I enjoy that, and there are other experts in the room. I'm not a criminal law expert, but there are other folks in the room who have worked on this. So I want to give you a little background about myself first. I grew up in Baltimore quite a while ago. I mean, some of you will think I'm kind of ancient. But when I grew up, believe it or not, Baltimore was a segregated city. Black people could not go. We called them Negroes then. That was the kind word. Behind their back, they were not called Negroes. And they could not go to the public swimming pools. They could not play on the public tennis courts. There were separate water fountains. I mean, this seems unreal. This was my childhood. I had lived in a neighborhood through my teens, which we called blockbusting in those days. The realtors would move in a group of black families to chase the whites out to the suburbs so that the prices would come down on the houses and they could make a quick deal. This was infamous. But my family didn't move. We actually couldn't afford to move. And my neighborhood was black. And those are the kids that I grew up with. And it was always fascinating to me, a little white girl going to very, very privileged, having a nice white school. I could go to the little country club where you paid $1 so you could go swimming in the pool. They couldn't. But my teenage friends in that neighborhood would come back and tell me what a typical Saturday night was like when they went out with their friends and walked along North Avenue and they were harassed by the police. And I couldn't believe this. I mean, I truly could not believe it. So it was beyond my personal experience, but it was the experience of children that I lived with on a day-to-day basis. So I come to this issue with really something in my gut that has been opposed to 2 or 3 tiered level of society that's based on race. And I tell you that from the outset. So the ACLU has been, I think, I asked them for my records once. I wanted to know when I joined. I didn't know if they went back that far, but I joined when I was 23 years old. And it has been something that has been just part of my life ever since I was, I started out being an English major in college, but I always liked to argue. And I thought that I could do good by becoming an attorney, and I went to the University of Washington Law School. And we wanted to start out with a little neighborhood. The 3 of us started straight out of law school, and we wanted to have a little neighborhood shop, but it turned out it just didn't work that way. So we got involved in just about every kind of case because we didn't have any money and we didn't have any clients, and anything that walked through the door we took. But some of the first things that I did to make money was to write appellate briefs in criminal law for the federal court. So that was my introduction. As a law school graduate, you really don't know much about doing practice. You're trained more to be analytical and write. So that's what I did for a while, which was interesting. And I also took on cases, which you can't do today because we now have various groups that take them on. But at that time I did some juvenile criminal work. I did 2 different cases in federal court, criminal cases. One was a drug deal, and the other was a woman who had been taking her tenants' mail so she could get their checks. But she was the landlord, so she excused that behavior. But in any event, I was convinced after those experiences that I never wanted to be a criminal law attorney. And I have the most admiration for them. And the reason was it was just too much stress. I did not feel I wanted to be responsible for people's lives to that degree, that they could go to prison. So that's a little bit about me. The ACLU has worked in the area of just about any area that involves civil liberties, but race, it's not thought of as a race organization. You think of the NAACP or the NAACP Legal Defense Fund or MALDEF for Latinos, but it has. And it has focused on race as kind of the bane of this society forever. And so today I'm going to focus on 2 areas that the ACLU has been focusing on, and ones that have been in the news quite a bit. One is what we call the school to prison pipeline. How many in the room have ever heard that phrase? This was a phrase that was coined years ago by the ACLU, believe it or not, because they were doing studies on the zero tolerance policies in schools, which you've probably heard of. How many of you have ever acted out in your public school?
Acted out?
Acted out,
Yeah.
in any way.
Don't lie.
Does stepping the quarterback count?
That's an assault.
He earned it.
It's still an assault.
Yep.
Did anything happen to you as a result of that?
My science teacher had never seen me lose my temper, so he took me, it happened in science class, he took me out of the room and he's like, "Are you okay?"
Okay.
Said he's not worth it and told me to go wash my face and walk it off.
Right. Now, that happened to you.
Yep.
So let's take a typical school nowadays where we have zero tolerance policies in our schools for just about any infraction. And if you're in certain schools, there'll be police who patrol the school, the hallways in the school.
That does not make it more secure.
Whether it makes it more secure or not, they're there.
Mm-hmm.
These folks don't have any training in kids. They don't have any training in child psychology. They're used to arresting people. So, with the zero tolerance policy, some people think truly that it is a basis for getting rid of kids. That you have overcrowded school systems, you have teachers who are overwhelmed, you have no child left behind, which is based on test scores, and the test scores look better if you don't have certain kids taking the test. So there's a supposition that even though the zero tolerance policy was done allegedly in response to places like Columbine, that it's been a useful tool to get rid of people we don't want, children we don't want, or certain people don't want. And there have been studies on what happens in this environment. So one of the studies, I'm going to just show you pieces of paper here, because they're really interesting. Let me find the right one. There was a study done in 2012, and it was based on 2009-2010 data. And it's called The Opportunity Suspended: The Disparate Impact of Disciplinary Exclusion from School. You can find this on ACLU's website by going to the school to prison pipeline information. But the numbers here are simply absolutely extraordinary on how many children are getting kicked out of school and that they're racially disparate. This doesn't just happen to all the little white kids. This is happening in a totally disproportionate way to people of color across the board. So, Black, Latino, Native American. We happen to be very fortunate here in the state of Washington. The city of Spokane came out the winner in suspending 44% of its Native American students. This is, to me, I was just absolutely flabbergasted. So it's real. And I can go through the statistics here, but what I want to do today is just tell you they exist, so I'm not going to totally bore you with them. But the worst part of it is that the school policies with zero tolerance disproportionately affect Black kids. And this study detailed the exclusion from school, but other studies have taken a look at how the children are impacted. So let's take your example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's pretend this wasn't a little white girl who kicked the football player. It was a little Black boy who kicked the football player. And you had a police officer in your school. So that's considered a physical assault.
Mm-hmm.
The football player, I assume, did not hit you back.
No, he didn't.
But that child can be taken out of the classroom, arrested, put in handcuffs, and taken to the police station where he can be processed as a criminal. Now, this is happening with great frequency, but it's not happening as much to white kids. It is happening to Black kids, and it's happening to Latino kids. So it's happening in these two fronts. One is the suspensions from school, and the other is the criminal front. This has had an impact on people of color that is just incredible. It's like taking them out and throwing them down the waste into the sewage. Because once they get there, if you're kicked out of school, you're not given alternative schooling, which should be your responsibility as a school system. You're left on the streets without supervision if your parents work. You're just, you're wandering around as a kid. But what do kids do? They find things to do with themselves, not always the best things to do. If you're suspended for 30 days or 60 days, you're allowed to go back to school. And then what happens? You're just hopelessly behind in school.
Yeah.
And in the course of all this, you're supposed to be entitled to a hearing. Let's take the suspensions. So I'll give you an example. You can watch these things on the ACLU website, which is aclu.org, if anybody's interested. So here's this perfectly charming looking teenager who's just been developing a project using Legos for his science fair, and he's holding up his fingers in a certain way, and I don't remember what they are. His teacher, white teacher, absolutely panics at the way he's holding up his hand and sends him to the principal's. Why? This is a gang symbol, she says. You get kicked out of school for wearing gang clothes, whatever those are, for flashing gang symbols. So this kid goes through a hearing. At the hearing, they do not consider the nature of his family, that it's a middle-class family, as it turns out. This kid was not flashing. He just denies it. He wasn't flashing. They don't consider how well he does in school. He was an A student in school. They get an expert in to say, well, I've looked on all the websites for gang symbols, and this is one of them. It turns out there was one example only on a website of somebody flashing that particular sign.
Shouldn't they have to prove that he had knowledge of it? Or he was guilty until he could prove he was innocent?
He was guilty, and they didn't consider any other circumstances in his life. He was kicked out of school. This is a real case, and there are many real cases. Kids have been either charged with criminal charges or suspended from school for carrying nail clippers to school. Most of these cases, they're black kids. It was interesting to me. I had just read, just 2 days ago, I think, an analysis, or heard a report just a couple of days ago about the overwhelming number of teachers in schools are white. I don't know if any of you heard this or saw it. And that the schools needed more people of color just for the students there. But the very fact that they're white engenders themselves a lot of the same stereotypes. Blacks are dangerous, kids are dangerous who are black, boys in particular. The kids, I don't know if any of you have read Justice Sotomayor's impassioned dissent in the most recent case involving an initiative, I can't remember which state, which said you just couldn't consider race in your school system. But she said people of color know that they are being tracked in a store when you walk into the store. They know that if you're in groups, people who are white are afraid of you. I was once walking back from work to my car, which there was nobody on this narrow street, and I hear a group of kids in back of me, about 4 or 5 teenage boys who are black. And I'm ignoring them because they're just kids. And I'm walking down the street, and one of the kids turns to the other so that I could hear it. He says, how come that lady, she don't turn around and she knows there's a bunch of black boys in back? And I just turned around and I just laughed. But that is the perception. So these kids are, because of their race, they're dangerous from the get-go. And that little boy, this young kid, he was dangerous because he had flashed a gang sign. He's just one of them. Even though he didn't know it was a gang sign, and they wouldn't have believed him if he'd said that, which he did, the ACLU took that case and got him back in school.
But couldn't make up for all the time he missed.
But look at how much time he lost from school, the position he was in. So it's very real. I'm just giving you a couple of examples because it's very real. So On the website, which I could not download all of this, it has it goes all the way down the page and it wouldn't print out. And this is the fault of the ACLU's website. And they need to get this corrected. But this says at the top, school to prison pipeline, school disciplinary policies disproportionately affect blacks. Zero tolerance discipline has resulted in black students facing disproportionately harsher punishment than white students in public schools. So, public school enrollment. This 51% over here, that's blacks. The 16% is whites. This is who's getting punished. Yes?
Do they have data on Hispanic students? I'm just curious.
Yeah, the Hispanic, it happens too. I mean, I have other reports here that talk about the race disparities, including the Hispanic
Are
students.
they closer to the rate for the blackness?
They're not as high.
I didn't think so, yeah.
They're not as high as the black
Worse
students.
than whites, though, I'm sure.
Oh, yes, it's worse than the whites. It's kind of in the pecking order you would think. It goes black, Latino, Native American is pretty high too, and depending where you are, because there are certain states in this country that have a higher number of Native Americans than others. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
I was wondering about Asian.
Asians are quite low. But I think if you had done, this was a broad analysis, and Asian encompasses a lot. So if you had done South Pacific in certain parts of the country, I think they'd probably be higher. This is my guess. I don't know about Filipino students, so I don't know what the sub-data are on all this, or the breakouts are. So multiple suspensions, they actually come a little closer together, but not in proportion to the population. So for multiple suspensions, one time after the next time after the next time, until it's basically fruitless to continue going to school anymore, 42% are black. Now when you consider that, at least in our neck of the woods here, that blacks are 10% or less of our population. I mean, these kind of data are true pretty much across the board. So what you're doing is and I wanted to read you the rest of this because I had to write it down because I couldn't get it printed out. Black students constitute 31% of school arrests. Here too, they're in the vast minority of the school population. They are suspended and expelled more than 3 times more than white students. Now,
so what's the percentage of the black students here compared to white? If they're a third of the arrests,
they're a third.
is
Can
it
you
10%
imagine
or is
that? I
it-
mean, the third is the number that just stuck in my brain. So can you imagine arresting a third of the white students?
Well, that's what I mean. How many students are actually black compared to white? And if it's
Well, if it's
3
like
to 1,
10%, then they're.
But that's national, isn't it? Is it? the
No,
same?
it
Okay.
depends on the area. So if you're in different school systems, they can be 50% of the school system. So if they're
Yeah.
then 31% of that, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's just huge. So these reports, as I said, they're online, and if people are interested in looking more into it, they can. So what's happened here, is this a conscious result of race discrimination, or what's going on? I can't answer that question. When we have what's called disparate impact, meaning you don't have somebody consciously going and saying, oh, that kid's black, I'm gonna get that kid. They're not doing it that way. I look at it as unconscious racism in the society, and I think it's quite real, just like the examples I just gave you. You know, this is a black group of teenagers walking down the street here in Bellevue versus a white group of teenagers walking down the street in Bellevue. What do you think people's perceptions are? And it is ingrained in us that blacks are dangerous, that they're poor, that they are drug addicts and drug users, that all they want is welfare. You just look at the news around you. Look at how the right wing, I'll call it the right wing, but I think it's an unconscious bias for just about everybody in the society. I think because you have been deluged with this for so long that it becomes real after a while.
Well,
And you have to
I'm-
fight against it. I mean, you truly have to fight against it.
yeah, because the biggest thing that I noticed among my white friends is they don't realize that they walk around with privilege every single day. And they're like, what? No, we don't have racism. And there are studies that have been done that covert racism is actually more damaging to people of color than overt racism.
Well,
It takes years off their lives.
whatever it is, people are not aware of it. People don't think they have it. I think I have it. I know I do. And so you have to, and I grew up with black kids around me all the time. We had most families, let's say in Bellevue, just have no contact with anybody who's a person of color. So that's one way that we have slowly started to fill our prisons, because once you get in there, once you get out and you're poor, you can't, and you're uneducated, there's really very little recourse for you in this society.
Do you think that the switch from public prisons to private prisons has made a difference?
Well, the studies will say it's made a big difference, because private contractors have a vested interest in keeping people in prison.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not going to get off onto that.
Okay.
So the second area I wanted to talk to you about was drugs. So let me just find my own notes on these. So our nation's drug policies. Everybody would think these are neutral, that we just have drug policies because drugs are bad. We have terrible cartels. They're doing bad things to people. And we have a society that makes a huge amount of money off of drugs. And we have people who are addicts and they're worthless kinds of people. But it wasn't because of those reasons. The drug policies prior to the 1920s were that we didn't have any. We had drugs available to anybody who wanted them, and they were frequently sold. They were called medicine after laws went into effect saying things. There was certain regulation on medicine. We had elixirs that were morphine based. They were used for kids with colic. Were used to help people go to sleep. But there was a shift, and the shift was explicitly racist, which is interesting. They made no bones about it. They decided that drugs would be illegal, and I cannot, for the life of me, remember the name of the guy who started this.
Hanslinger. After you get me marijuana in 1979.
No, I'm talking about the earlier drug laws. But he said it was about the 1920s, very upset about jazz clubs, very upset about blacks using marijuana. He went on a campaign that blacks who used marijuana could, this got them all aroused and they could rape our white women. We had waves of immigrants, predominantly Latino. These were used against the Latino society at that time. So the whole basis of our initial drug laws was blatantly racist, and it was stated as such. But actually, despite them, we didn't really have a huge population going to prison because of the drug laws. This didn't happen until the Nixon era, when we had the war on drugs. And the war on drugs has been devastating to the black community in particular, and to the Latino community. And my friend David here has read Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow. Has anybody looked at that book? I would recommend it highly to everybody, because because she lays out step by step by step by step by step all of the laws, all of the way the laws have been enforced, on why this is taking blacks, particularly black men, but it also includes black women, and putting them into prison in the disproportionate way that they are. And it's finally being recognized somewhat that really this is what's happening. There was an editorial just on May 1st in the Seattle Times called "The First Step to Ending the Federal Drug Problem." And it specifically mentions that race is the biggie. That's the reason. And it's the reason that we are the leader in the Western world in terms of incarceration. So this is us. Here we start in the 1960s and 70s. These are kind of drug crimes and the people in prison. And it skyrockets. This is an article that just came out. And this was in the New York Times, believe it or not, business section on April 30th. And the reason it was in the business section is because some folks, mostly the states, now are recognizing that they can't keep this up, that prison is bankrupting the states.
Spend more on prisons than education.
One of the articles says we spend more on prisons nationally than for food stamps in this country. We spend billions and billions of dollars. And yet we have people fighting over whether to give people food stamps. So we increased our incarceration rate due to the drug war from about 100 people going to prison per 100,000 up to 800 people going to prison per 100,000. And today, nearly half of the state and federal prisons are black prisoners, and most of that is due to drug convictions. And the statisticians estimate that a black boy born in 2001 had a 32.2% chance of time behind bars. Can you imagine if 1/3 of the white population knew it was going to spend time in prison, that was the data?
How do you have any hope to get up in the morning and do anything?
Well, people are pretty resilient despite the awful things that happen to them, but that is true. One would think it would be hopeless. We're fortunately, as these articles, which are very recent, come to show that there is some hope for change. I mean, you have Obama saying finally that he'll release some folks from prison due to crack cocaine. I mean, there are close to, and he has asked, and there's an association now of public defenders from around the country who are supposed to put forth their names for exoneration. And this came about actually due to the ACLU and various studies that they had done on drugs. And they got articles in the New York Times about individuals who had not had any violent crime whatsoever in their situations, and their really extraordinary lengthy criminal sentences for drug crimes that didn't harm. I mean, they were not violent crimes, and they were not even involving robberies. They were possession crimes.
It was a consensual crime.
I thought the background for Obama's recent effort to get those names is because this is no longer a mandatory sentence for these specific crimes. And so now there's an imbalance because it's retroactive. And so those people are spending years and years in jail, whereas if they did the same exact thing today, they would probably spend far, far less time in jail.
Well, you're pointing out crack cocaine versus powder cocaine.
Right.
And that too was racist.
Right.
Yes, and that was blatantly racist because crack cocaine was directed at the black community, which used crack cocaine in a disproportionate amount to powder cocaine. I think it's cheaper.
And kills 1 out of 10 people.
And the data are that people who use crack cocaine, not only do they go to prison more, But they also spend another 2 years longer than somebody who used powder cocaine as part of their term. So it's been disproportionate across the board. So I want to talk about some of the data on Washington. So because we live in Washington, but before I do that, between 2001 and 2010, and I'm going to talk about marijuana since we passed this marijuana law here. Between 2001 and 2010, 52% of all drug arrests in the whole United States were for possession of marijuana. And Seattle, I want to take Seattle as an example of the disproportionality. Even though blacks in Seattle are 10% or less of the population, they were arrested, and Seattle's a rural city, right? They were arrested and charged at a rate 8 to 9 times that of whites. And we have found that the usage of marijuana is pretty equal among races, as many whites, as many blacks, as many Latinos use marijuana. So basically, and when I saw that data, I was absolutely shocked. And I knew that the public defenders in Seattle were trying desperately to do something about this, and they really weren't having much success with the prosecution. So it has, as I said, this is the effect on blacks, Latinos, and others. This has been paramount civil rights issue to me since its inception. And that is why the ACLU has had a policy on its books that its board adopted before I got on the board. And that's a long time ago, because I've been on the board for 30 years or more. They had a policy that said drugs should be decriminalized. And people think, well, they think that, that policy is drugs should be decriminalized because people should have a choice of what they're going to do, blah, 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 blah. No, it's because it's been race-based. That's why. So we've had people working on drug issues for decades. And there are national organizations that have been working on drug issues for decades. Besides the ACLU, there are quite a few of them. And there have been people with money, such as George Soros and Peter Lewis, who recently died, the head of Progressive Insurance, who've been very concerned about drug issues. And there were a couple of failed attempts to pass laws on marijuana. And I'm not talking about medical marijuana, although as we've seen, there's been a slow turning of the tide for medical marijuana. Not every state has medical marijuana laws, but that's slowly increasing. So one of our staff attorneys here in Washington State, Allison Holcomb, came to me one day with this draft piece of legislation. And she said, Judy, I want you to take a look at this. And this legislation was what subsequently has turned out to be Initiative 502. And the major thing about it was raising money. This is going to be a statewide campaign. People didn't know who was going to come out and oppose it. Certainly people thought that the folks who were invested in making money and have a living off of drugs might put up a big fight. It meant changing the mentality for most people. The biggest concern when I went to talk about I-502 was people would always say, what about our kids? I'd say, well, this is for people 21 or older. Your kids, if they want marijuana, they can get it in school just as easily now as they'll be able to get it. Hopefully it might even decrease the ability to get it down the road because there might not be as much illegal stuff on the streets. We don't know that yet. So I want to give you some numbers. I know people kind of close their eyes at numbers, but in 2009, there were 7,964 court filings in Washington State for low-level marijuana offenses. Now just think, what does that mean in terms of money that the state has to pay? You know, you have the cop who's doing the arrest. That's that person's salary and time. You have to book them. You have to have a jail system. You have to, which costs a lot of money per day to house people. You may even have to appoint a public defender who, if they're doing their job, which is a different issue here, we have other cases about defenders doing their job. They have to be paid. Maybe they have to have some experts to help them. You know, what's the purity of this marijuana? You know, was this a true drug buy? Was this person set up? So who's a witness? And then you have the court system that has to be paid. You have the prosecutor who has to be paid and their staff. And then eventually you may have prison. So it costs a fortune. It's costing the state a lot of money to do these little teeny busts. In 2010, we had 6,743 filings. In 2011, we had 6,879. In 2012, we had 5,531. And in 2013, 120. And this is on the ACLU of Washington's website, which I encourage you to look at. You can get to that by www.aclu-wa.org. And it says court, and this was just posted on March 19th, and it says court filings for adult marijuana possession plummet.
I wonder if those 100 were all in one area, like one sheriff that is.
I don't know. I'm sure.
I heard that some sheriffs have said they don't care, so that would continue to arrest.
Well, there have been folks who said they won't allow any of the stores,
Bellevue.
certain places down near Tacoma said the federal law is the federal law, I'm not going to allow this.
I was just curious. So that's
I don't know, and so, you know, if you really have that question, I would just email the ACLU office and ask them. Yeah, George.
So this is obviously very good news here, and it seems like nationally, it seems like the zeitgeist is kind of changing around the failed war on drugs. It seems that people are starting to understand the cost that goes into this. But I'm wondering, is there any hope at seeing, on a nationwide level, seeing the drug policies change? We've had some success here locally, but how long might we expect the war on drugs to continue on a national level?
I'm supposed to put my seer hat.
Yes.
Get out my tarot cards. Let's take prohibition, which is the only analogy that we have. You know, we've had states that after a while, because of the violence that was associated with prohibition, the fact that people want to drink, the fact that here people want to use marijuana, and do, we had prohibition topple little by little by little in states that refused to go along with prohibition. So we've now seen two examples, Colorado and us. I expect that there will be momentum for this, because if you take a look nationally, even among, I mean, I've heard the most right-wing Christian commentators talking about, or what's the guy, the libertarian, the senator, saying we shouldn't be involved in drugs. You know, and he sees this as an individual liberty. I see it as devastation of our communities of color. So, you know, we have a different way of looking at it, but really, I think it's going to get to that point. I mean, you have Allison Holcomb, who wrote this legislation in conjunction with a lot of other people. It was very thoughtfully done. Was invited to Uruguay to talk because the whole country decided as a country that they were going to legalize or decriminalize, you know. But I mean, if you can get tax dollars on it, and if that is an example, it actually works to get tax money, I think this will be a good incentive for most states. They're cash strapped. Why not why not take advantage of it? They've certainly taken advantage of gambling and, lotteries, because they need the money. So I can't give you a prognostication. I'm not that good.
Do you think we are trending that direction at least?
I think so.
Sounds
I
like-
think we will. Probably, it's not gonna be finished in my
It seems
lifetime,
like the,
probably, but,
Seems like on the national level, there's a lot of attention being paid to how it plays out in these states and how the tax revenues,
yeah, and it's an experiment. We will see. What you also have to consider is the vested interest on the other side of keeping employment full for the DEA, for all of those involved in the war on drugs, for the prisons, we talked about the private prisons, for the private prisons and their contractors. And Michelle Alexander's book is terrific on this point. And the seizures that go along with drug laws. So you're driving in your car and you happen to have, 2 ounces or an ounce of marijuana. Well, they don't just take your drugs, they take your car.
Civil forfeiture.
Yes, civil forfeitures.
If
Even
you're
even if you
renter.
don't have anything really, even if you're not really connected with the crime, if you know the person or you live in the same house with the person, you can have your property seized.
That's right.
If you're the landlord and your renter gets stuff
Yeah.
seized at the house, they
Right.
can take your.
Right, and there was actually a U.S. Supreme Court case on this point on a drug seizure by what we call an innocent spouse.
Yeah.
And, to me, the decision was horrendous. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on the side of saying, oh yeah, the government could seize the, whatever property it was, but it was something that the woman, the wife, needed to live. But no, that was perfectly okay. So there's a lot of money, and this money goes to the police. It goes back into their pockets. So there's a huge, George, to answer your question, there's a huge vested interest on the other side wanting to keep it in place. So those are the 2 topics I was going to, hit on race discrimination in this country and how our prison system is tied together. When I went to, I was telling David, I had gone to a Martin Luther King Day gathering that the King County Bar has every year. And Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, was the speaker. And she just gave an incredible, and it was the best attended one of these I'd ever been at. And she gave an incredible talk going through some of the details of her book. But what was more striking to me was the MC. The MC was Richard Jones, who's a federal court district judge here in Washington. He happens to have gone to the class of 1975 from the UW Law School, which was my class. And he got up, and he's normally a pretty reserved guy, very judicious, quite thoughtful, and he gave his personal experiences of going into federal prisons, he's black, and being shocked because 90% of the prisoners in the prisons that he was visiting were black. So this is devastating our black male community, and it's been doing it for a long time, and I certainly hope things change. It's become more publicized, but I think white America doesn't believe it. I truly think they don't.
So one thing you didn't mention, and I'm interested, I think there is recent news from yesterday, is about the fact that convicted felons cannot vote.
That's right.
Which means that all of these black people who are in jail for drugs are no longer eligible for voting and cannot democratically change this, although they have a personal experience that is very...
Yes.
And I think yesterday Ron Paul said that he would support letting them vote.
This is on a state-to-state basis. It's not a matter of federal law, it's a matter of state law. And in Washington, the ACLU, this state, we actually brought a court challenge to that and lost. We brought a court challenge. There's another side issue to this. When you have a drug crime on your record, it's not just losing the right to vote.
Can't get food stamps.
You can't get
Can't
food
get public
stamps.
housing and
You can't get public housing, you can't get tuition to go to public, you can't get federal tuition or, or loans to go to school.
So you're homeless and hungry.
So what it does is compound it. In addition to that, which is another issue that the local ACLU is working on, is as a result of going to prison, you are assessed with various fines. And what's been happening throughout the counties, they administer these differently. So you get out and all of a sudden you have this huge debt.
But you're a felon.
But,
So we want to get a job.
but you don't have a job. And arrest records, they're not supposed to be public, but they become public, and certainly criminal convictions are public and they're on the website. Any website, any employer who's looking, can screen to see whether or not somebody has had any kind of jail or prison term. So that makes your things the odds even greater and more difficult for you about getting a job. But what's been happening, and this is something the ACLU has been challenging here in this state, are that if people can't pay, they're hauled into court, back to court, and they're told to pay, and they say, I can't pay. And they say, too bad, you're going to prison until back to jail until you pay. Now, this is pauper's
Debtor's
prison.
prison, yeah.
Yes, you would think, how can we have that in this day and age? It's happening all over. I actually brought that just to show you. There's a report on that on the ACLU website. Modern day debtors' prisons. There's a whole report on this. It's on the ACLU website in conjunction with Columbia Legal Services. So I was thinking of things to talk about with you today, but I wanted to bring a smattering of things because all of this has ramifications down the line.
Not only is it racist, it's just stupid.
It's costing them, putting people in jail more than the fines. Yes.
I wonder if you can just talk about the history of federal determinate sentencing and where that's at today.
No, that's not my bailiwick. I used to do post-conviction relief for folks down at, I told you I did a smattering of everything. We used to have McNeil Island be a federal prison here.
Yeah.
And as I said, we were looking for clients. We didn't have a lot of clients when we first started out. And one of the things we did was post-conviction relief for federal prisoners at McNeil Island. And what did this mean? At that time, we had a parole commission. And the parole commission would have guidelines for what the sentence should be for the crime. So they would then set the sentence, the actual sentence. It wasn't the judge in the courtroom who set the sentence. It was the parole board who set the sentence. The very first case that my partner argued before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals was that it didn't comply with what's called the Administrative Procedures Act. They are what's an administrative agency, and any administrative agency is supposed to follow certain rules that are set out in the Administrative Procedures Act, and they didn't follow them. Now, he took this case because in law school, there was this clinical program, we call it, and it was to help prisoners. So I actually, there weren't very many clinical programs in those days for lawyers, for law students, and law students always want to get hands-on experience. And so I took part in that, and he took part in that. And he worked with federal prisoners, and I worked with folks at Monroe, to see what could be done for them while they were in prison. And so he made this argument. It was actually an excellent argument because what the parole board did not comply at all with the rules that are supposed to be in effect. Well, he lost. And he lost, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, at that time in San Francisco, you had to go down and argue in San Francisco. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals says, this guy's right. It doesn't comply. Like, wow, you think you should win, right? It is an agency, it's an administrative agency. They're not following the law, and they said, but, this practice has been going on a long time, so what? Now, this is the court saying the law doesn't matter.
Oh.
He argued this case a year after we got out of law school, because he'd been doing all the work before that. So my husband used to ask, he's a scientist, he says, why do you want to be a lawyer? He said, you have the law on your side, you may even have the facts on your side, and you lose. How can that happen? You know? And my partner Stephen went to our constitutional law expert at the University of Washington Law School, and he told him about this case, and the professor read the case, he couldn't believe it either. So, but that's the way it used to be. So what you're finding around the country as a result of that have been sentences that are all over the map for the same offense. And actually, so I think, I'm not positive, we have a criminal law person in the room who may know better than I, but I think that was part of the thought of making sentences determinate for the court, to stop having the disparity from one place to the next due to whatever the particular parole board, would do in your jurisdiction. Is that
Yeah,
your
so the
understanding?
Sentencing Reform Act is what we work out of. So like the federal system, there's a grid. And originally, it was they did a good job of taking, mapping the grid and figuring out what this sentence for things should actually be. But then what subsequently happens is that they go and they monkey with the grid. So essentially, your on-the-ball legislators here in Bellevue have essentially decided that car theft should be a death penalty case because they got tired of having their cars stolen. So that you have they introduce these new factors like doubling and tripling, considering misdemeanors as felonies for the purposes of sentencing, so that you get some kid with with a couple of car thefts and he's looking at like 10 years in prison. So the system continues to evolve and find new and shocking ways to screw the board.
And on the federal law side, you had Congress saying that crack cocaine was worth more punishment.
Right, that's the federal. Yeah.
On the federal side, but that was the rationale. It was actually to make it not as discriminatory. But in effect, what it did was to judges, they would see a particular case come in front of them, and they would lament. I mean, they have on the record in their cases, at the sentencing hearings, they would say, this was a mule in a drug case. This was the wife of somebody, and she knew about the drugs in the house. And they're arresting her and charging her in order to try to get guys at the top, and they're not gonna, some of them are not gonna rat because that puts their life or their family's life in danger. So you have people going to prison at rates far in excess of what their crimes really merited. And this has been quite problematic, particularly in the drug arena. And judges they're on the front line. And they see this day to day to day. And some of them would write in their decisions that they had no choice, how horrible and unfair this was. And finally, a couple of judges said, we're not going to do this. And then those were appealed. And there was a Supreme Court case on this which upheld the judge's right to do that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, so the sentencing, so the interesting thing happened with the federal sentencing guidelines.
I'm talking about the feds.
Yeah, is that they said, you're right, this is wrong, but then the way they say that is, well, they're just guidelines. And in general, the judges say, we love these guidelines. And they just follow them as much as they ever did, so.
Sometimes you'll have a judge who doesn't.
Right.
Or sometimes, particularly when it's white-collar crime that's involved, they don't. So we see that disparity between what happens to people who rob banks from the inside don't get the same kind of sentences as people who rob banks from the outside. So there are whole vast topics out there on criminal law, and I've just covered very few because I wanted to focus on race. But another one, of course, is the death penalty, and that is just as race-biased as any. And I'm open to any questions you folks may have.
What's your thought on third strike?
I thought it was crazy from the beginning. So tell them what third strike means.
Okay, so the third strike means is that Washington has been sort of an innovator in this bizarre and innovative area of incarcerating people for ungodly lengths of time. So that if you're charged with a so-called strike offense and you get 3 of them, you have a mandatory lifetime prison sentence. With sex cases, 2 strikes. Interestingly, things that are strikes are not necessarily what you would have thought. There's been a lot of work to dial it back, but in general, people who are there for third strike are, so assault 2s is a strike, rob 2 is a strike as well. So robbery, taking to take by force or threat of force the property of another. So interestingly, that can be a threat. There might not be a gun. That it's a rob one if there's a gun anyway. There might not be a firearm involved. And assault 2s, that especially in Washington, assault is a very bizarre crime that that you can get there a lot of different ways. Recently, what used to be a misdemeanor now is promoted to an assault 2. Anything involving a strangulation is an assault 2. So it's a strike offense. So you think that you would see that the Ted Bundys of the world and who would be the victims of who would be captured in the third strike net, but no, it's in general some 19-year-old kid who took a skateboard or something like that. So taking by force or threat of force, rob 2, gets a couple of those, and he's gone for good.
So there is actually a Supreme Court case on this, and it arose in California. And my recollection may not be complete on this. But there was a challenge to 3 strikes you're out, meaning you do these 3 crimes and you're going away for life. And the challenge was under the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution, that this was cruel and unusual punishment. It was far excessive. It was just to the point where it was now cruel. It wasn't necessarily unusual, but it was cruel.
Yeah.
And the case involved, I'm searching here because I didn't research this before I got here. Some guy who had had similar kinds of thefts, which are thefts by force. So let's say I had a kid who was 13 years old and he was brought up for rolling a drunk. Well, that's a bodily, who was conked out. And he took his wallet.
He touched him.
That is considered a robbery because it's of the person. That is a very serious crime. When you think of a robbery, you think of somebody, assaulting you with a gun or, doing something physically harmful to you. But the crimes that were involved in California were of the first kind I just described. They did not involve any bodily injury, but they were considered to be severe crimes because they were directed against the person. And the third one he had was taking a golf club from, I think it was a golf club, but this is what's sticking in my brain. I could be wrong. But he had stolen a golf club by, pulled it out of somebody's hands or out of the proprietor's hands or whatever. The value of this club, some of these crimes have attached, whether they qualify, a dollar amount, some don't, because this was considered an assault because you grab it out or a robbery. It was what we would consider to be a trivial crime.
Mm-hmm.
This was charged in California as the third crime. It went up to the Supreme Court on the 8th Amendment grounds, and the court said, oh, that's fine. They can do whatever they want. So that was upheld. This guy went away for life for a series of what we would call petty thefts because of the way they were done. And they said this was not cruel and unusual. Now, this was not a majority. There was a dissent, of course, in this case. But we've lived with that for a long time now. California was kind of the start of this. Any other kinds of questions?
Are there any private prisons in Washington that you know of?
Any
Private prisons?
I'm not aware of any.
They're building one for children in Seattle right now.
Yeah, well, the one that they're doing for the juvenile detention center is as a lease agreement or something. I just read about it in the paper. I'm not sure what it's going to be. Yes?
How are they, I don't understand why they're legal, private prisons. The concept of having an incentive to incarcerate people is crazy making to me. What needs to happen to make them illegal?
Contract.
Because
I don't know the answer to that question,
Okay. I was
actually.
hoping you would.
I wish I did. See, the question always is, to what extent, if this is being used to house publicly convicted prisoners, to what extent does it become like a public prison, you know, and susceptible to the same kinds of oversight and susceptible to the same kind of due process concerns that we might have, and the standard of care. Now, the standard of care in both public and private prisons is pretty deplorable. If you read about California in particular and their prison system, I mean, it's enough to think that we are a country that tortures people, our own people, right here in our country. It's gruesome to read what's been happening in California in the prisons. But what makes it bizarre to me, I have never understood why we contract out to private prisons, because it costs the government so much more money to pay for the profit incentive here. But what they do is they cut corners so that people are not fed as well. They're denied medical care to an even greater extent than we have in our public prisons. And they're not necessarily, it varies, but they're not necessarily held to the same standards as your government would be held in running the prison.
Same thing's happening to the military.
Well, yeah, we've contracted out the military essentially too.
Yeah.
But, you know, so I've never understood it because it costs so much more. Why are we doing this?
And social services. But of course, this is all heresy because the free market is the best way to reduce costs.
Yeah.
Okay, you can have that discussion. I'm not going to.
With those facts to contradict it.
I was appalled. I was out in Union Club visiting my mother, and I needed to take the bus back in, and there was this young woman at the bus stop, and she goes, "Could you pay for my bus back into Kent?" And I was like, "Sure." She said, "I just got out of jail. They take King County prisoners when they have overflow, and they take them out to Enumclaw, where they feed them frozen TV dinners like the Swanson's kind. That's what they get fed. And then they have to get back from Enumclaw somehow on their own."
So what we're finding, this is part of the articles that are recent articles on the cost of the prison system. What states are finding is they're overwhelmed by the expense. So it's the cost that has led to some de-incarceration efforts. And these are ongoing around the various states. I heard at an ACLU gathering, I heard the head of the prison system of Mississippi, mind you, come in and talk about how they were letting go. They're more elderly. I didn't know how these folks were going to get medical care, but they're more elderly prisoners.
That's why they're kicking them out.
So they didn't think they're going to commit any more crimes, and they're letting them out. And this is happening throughout. This is actually starting to happen throughout the states. They're starting to, we've had some efforts to keep people out of prison in the first place because it's so expensive. Just yesterday, I was listening to public radio station, and they were talking about juvenile and how they were putting GPS leg monitors on the kids to keep them out of the detention system because it was costing $400 and something a day to keep them in it, and this was a lot cheaper. These also have their downsides. You can, for various reasons, but it was keeping them out of the system, at least in terms of being put into detention, which is just another word for jail.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, George.
It is really heart-wrenching, the prison situation here. The statistic I heard, which really stood out to me, was this so alarming, was that the United States has
more prisoners incarcerated for non-violent drug crimes than Western Europe does for all crimes combined, and Western Europe has a larger population.
And 54% of those are black.
If I can maybe ask you to jump tracks for a minute.
If I can.
Yeah, can you speak at all about the recent Supreme Court ruling with cell phone search and seizures and the Fourth Amendment concerns surrounding police being able to seize your cell phones and that information without a warrant?
Okay, I'm not sure which case you're referring to, one that's in the U.S. Supreme Court right now, or what? There is a case that's been argued.
Yeah, the one that they've been arguing.
And then there's been different cases in Washington State. Now let me focus on Washington State first. Washington State has its own constitution, as does every state. And the judges on our state Supreme Court have been educated about our state constitution. There was a big push when Rehnquist got on the bench by judges in 2 states, one Vermont and one Oregon, who were very upset about the trend that was happening with the U.S. Supreme Court. And there was a movement to start using state constitutions as a basis to protect people's rights and to look at them in a different way. So is the Fourth Amendment, which says you can't have any unlawful searches and seizures, which is what the cell phones would be without a warrant or probable cause. Is our law different from that? Because it's worded differently. And our court decided here in Washington that it was different, that our protections were much stronger than the Fourth Amendment's. So we have what's called an independent state ground for the decision. So in Washington State, we have one volunteer attorney at the local office, and he is concerned with privacy. This comes under the rubric of privacy law, including criminal law under the Fourth Amendment. And he has been writing one brief after the next on these issues as technology comes in. So our state long ago said, okay, it's okay for the feds to go rifle through your garbage can because you put it out in the alley. But our citizens have a greater right to privacy, and it isn't okay for our police to rifle through your garbage can to find incriminating information. So you can see there's a big distinction. So our state has been very strong where the cases have been coming up on saying this is illegal under our state privacy law. The feds are more difficult. I have no idea what the court's going to do with the cell phone issue. You know, cell phones are taken, and then they flip through the cell phone. They find where you've called. They can make. I think this one arose in a drug case. You know, with that. This is somebody who was calling dealers and to make buys or to make sales. It was done without a warrant. It was done, you know. The issue is this covered under the Fourth Amendment as some of your private papers and effects? And I think that's not resolved yet. And given our U.S. Supreme Court, I must say I don't have a lot of hope for that. And including Justice Breyer, who one would think would be a liberal. He comes out on the liberal side in many cases, but not in criminal law cases, not at all. So, I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that? Have you been following it?
Well, the way I handicap these is that, having been an attorney for a while now, that the law exists to protect rich people from poor people.
Yeah.
So if you handicap cases with that, you can sometimes get a good picture of how things are going to turn out. And since rich people are affected by having their phones rifled through, I think that we could get a good, get a plausible result there.
You might think that. On the other hand, the rich people think, well, I haven't done anything wrong, so it's okay. People's sense of privacy, what's important to them, has been eroded more and more and more as you have opened the door to say these things don't matter. And for young people, I was at a conference on this not too long ago, and for young people, it's of more concern. I mean, I'm one of these old fuddy-duddies, you know, so I've kind of grown up when we didn't have cell phones, right? To me, this is an incredible invention. And I think my law firm was one of the last ones to start using computers. I mean, we certainly got used to them. We couldn't do without them anymore. But my grandchildren, my son, and all their friends, they're all on Facebook, you know? And they're communicating all the time about their private lives. And the younger ones are particularly stupid about it. You know, some of these things can come, they don't know, they're kids. Some of these things can come back and haunt them later on in their lives. But what we call the expectation of privacy has been slowly eroded. So, you know, if you can get a judge to personalize it, you're a lot better off. If they, just like you said, if they think, oh yeah, I have a cell phone, somebody can see that I went to the doctor, you know, somebody can see, you know, all these different kinds of calls that I make, then they might understand it. I've always found that when people can identify themselves, you stand a lot better shot. I'll give you an example of that. This was a privacy case. It had to do with searching people's bags as they went in to see a sports event when we had the Old Kingdom. This was a real privacy issue. You could just look in somebody's purse. You know, this was pre 9/11, okay? And one of the judges wrote, I can't remember whether he wrote it or whether he just asked the question in oral argument. He says, do you mean they could just open up my wife's pocketbook and rifle around in there? And he said, yes, that's what it meant. Well, this appalled him. See, so it was, and in that case, our state Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, which made us unique. Again, it was based on our state's law. But I agree with you, you know, it just depends how much they can really and truly empathize, because it can happen to them. Not sympathize, empathize.
I was reading some of the transcripts from the recent Supreme Court's, what's it called, where the justices are talking amongst themselves, debating amongst themselves about it? There's a name for that process.
In their colloquies, you mean?
What's that?
In their colloquies in chambers?
Probably. But they were, one of the justices was trying to make the point that
you're not supposed to have records of that.
What's that?
This was actually in chambers after an argument.
I don't know.
It couldn't have been now, because that's a no-no to disclose that. Maybe unless one of their law clerks let out the cat out of the bag years later. But on the bench, those are recorded. You can listen to the arguments in the U.S. Supreme Court they are recorded, and people can listen to those, so you can hear the questions. And frequently on the bench, they'll talk to each other.
So that's
they're attacking each other.
That's perhaps where this was from. And one of the justices was trying to make the point that nowadays people have more personal and private information in their phone than they do in their house. Mm-hmm. And asked one of the other justices what he had on his phone. And he said that he could not get into his smartphone because of the passcode protection. So this is somebody who basically couldn't program the VCR and is obviously not qualified to be making these decisions.
Well, you can say that. I mean, I agree with you, and they have to be educated, and that's. I remember an attorney. This was quite a few years ago, and it was one of the first electronic, something that involved computers and the internet. And when you write a brief to the Supreme Court, you cite, you write down what the case is, you might write down the name of the book that you're relying on, the scholars that you're relying on. Well, all these things that this guy wanted to put into the brief were online. So today in briefs, you will actually see the citation to an online something, you know. And if you get the brief electronically, you can just click on it, right? And be automatically taken over to that site. Well, these judges didn't know that at all. They're used to get things in paper. They had a certain number of copies that they get. These are all handed out to the court. And this is somebody who was on the National ACLU board from Philadelphia, Jim. And he was going to send them electronically how they could click what the citation was. It was a first. They've never done that before. So at least now they know how to do, one hopes they know how to do that, or certainly their law clerks know how to do that, and they all have younger law clerks who at least they can consult with and ask how their phones work. And one hopes that they do that, because the ignorance is, you know, it is really true, you're correct. And how can you make decisions about something you completely don't understand? Let me just do a segue, totally different case, Myriad Genetics. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that case. This was an ACLU case brought on to say that you can't patent the BRCA gene, which is a breast cancer gene that this company, Myriad Genetics, had patented. And in his either concurrence or dissent, it's written by Clarence Thomas, who you know doesn't know anything about this. And the whole decision is very technical on patenting and the BRCA gene, this, that, and the other, which they must have taken, of course, from the record in the case or the lawyers who were submitting their briefs. And Justice Scalia says, well, I don't know, I can't understand any of this stuff. It was the most fascinating. He's correct. He said, I don't see how I can sign on to this because I really don't understand it. That was the most candid, it was true.
Yeah.
And I was totally shocked that somebody would come out and say, yes, I'm a total ignoramus about this issue.
Appreciate the honesty though.
Yeah, even if it's from Scalia, right.
Well, one thought about that. So the standard that they apply in Fourth Amendment cases, you know, so the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, and free from unreasonable search and seizure, what that's come to mean is that if something is knowingly exposed to the public, so that, for example, when you put your phone number in and it goes into a PIN register in the 60s, they said, well, hey, you know, it's in the phone. You know, you expose that number to the public. You don't have any expectation of privacy in that. You write a check, it goes to the bank. You don't have any expectation of privacy in that. So that has kind of cut sort of shockingly for most people against privacy. But what's interesting about the cell phones is, as you point out, George, is that, you know, you have this password-protected device, you know, that it's completely encrypted. There's no way you can just open it and look at it. It's locked in a million different ways. So yeah, you should have an expectation of privacy in that. The question is whether the expediency of law enforcement, you know, would trump that.
Hasn't that gone back and forth a few times, whether you're compelled, you have to be compelled to reveal passwords?
There are some cases that have done that, but there they were subject to a subpoena and a court order. But let's say the guy has the cell phone in his car, and he's been using his cell phone, so it's been de-passworded. You know, it's on. You know, and that's what the police are looking at. But even so, I'm sure these guys can, have people who can.
Sure, they
break
can plug it into
passcodes.
something.
Probably
dump all
argue
the
it as a-
information out of it, and store that, download all the information from it.
Well, the other thing is that what you just mentioned about the expectation of privacy under the Fourth Amendment is the court has long said bank records aren't secure, even though you might think whoever you write a check to is secure. Because it goes to the bank, it's processed, other people look at it. Well, just think of today. Your cell phone is not, any cell phone, any cable phone is part of a system that's somewhere else.
Far more people see your medical
It's in the
records than see your bank
cloud.
records.
People can have access to it in a different way. And the exposure there, I know it's one that drives attorneys crazy, and I'm glad I'm not at the law firm now to have to deal with that, because we had our own server, but even the servers go through connections. So is all this now public? You know, these are major, major questions in this technological era, and we're kind of diverging from what I came to talk about, but.
I just wanted to go back, and it's not something that's, you know, that there's much discussion about, but we were saying there's no private jails here, but actually when you mentioned Enumclaw, Redmond, and Linwood all have jails that they contract the other cities, send prisoners there. And those are for profit. I don't know where the city does with the money, but they wouldn't just have them out of, they're not just cooperating. Like some of the fire departments cooperate with each other because they're saving money on training and some other things. But in the case of Enumclaw and Redmond and Linwood, those are for-profit jails.
But to the best of my
they're
knowledge,
not
they're
privately
owned by.
owned.
Right.
No, I understand
Yeah.
that, but there's still the profit motive, and there's still similar issues of
Yeah.
cost cutting, and anyway, I didn't mean to distract from the.
No,
other
they do
interesting
that,
discussion.
and because the jails have been overcrowded, because the prisons have been overcrowded, what you find is that people are shunted off to really remote. I mean, for most people, for an attorney to get out to Enumclaw to talk to their client who's really being charged in Seattle or in Kent because they don't have the jail facilities is really difficult. I mean, it really cuts down on the amount of the attorney-client contact, and it's another way.
Right.
And it cuts people off from their families, making it even worse for them. But yeah, that's a big subject. It's been going on for a long time. And these little jails, because they haven't been filled to capacity, this is a way for the towns to make money on them.
Well, they actually built them to make money on.
Oh, really?
Redmond just-
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Redmond's is, you know, it's probably only, I don't know, 10 years old, and it was specifically built to take prisoners from the other cities.
Yeah, no,
David,
Enumclaw's
you had
been
a
there a long
question?
time.
It's been there a long time,
Yeah.
but anyway.
How do you think decriminalizing marijuana is going to affect the incarceration rate in Washington?
I think it's going to be dramatic.
Yeah.
And I think that's terrific. I think particularly in the Black community, obviously, but in Eastern Washington is the Latino community. It has been used in Eastern Washington to put a lot of Latinos in jail and even into the prison system. So I think that will help. I think it's also helpful psychologically that it works. I mean, you know, we have a way to go before it's kind of proven. But we've had, and you were mentioning this, drug courts in this state for a long time to try to keep, because the judges and the prison system, the whole prosecutors, everybody knows how much money this costs. And if you can keep people out of the system to begin with and give them a chance to rehabilitate or whatever, this actually saves the taxpayers a lot of money. I know when Jay Inslee came in, one of the first things I talked to him about three things. One was getting rid of the death penalty, which I've harped on with him every time I talk to him. Number two was starting to decrease the rate of incarceration, and whatever he could do, that would be helpful, because our state is in dire need of money, and this is costing us an arm and a leg to keep all those prisoners in. And three was starting children at a young age to go to, preschool. Those three things, because having children who can be acculturated and have a stable place to be are less likely to have trouble down the road. And there's been lots of data on that.
So did you want to kick in when you vetoed the budget where the legislature took the money from biotech for education and you vetoed it? I wanted to kick in.
Look, he just vetoed the drone stuff, which I went down and met with his staff to get that passed, but I think that'll come to pass. I was away on vacation when he did the moratorium on the death penalty, and I got home and I looked at my computer because I had this desire not to look at the computer when I was away.
It's a good plan.
And I just screamed. I mean, I just was like overjoyed.
Yeah.
But it's a moratorium. It's not a commutation of the death sentences. So we'll see where that goes.
Well, you have time for one more? We're running a little bit long, but maybe one more question?
There was one question over here.
So, I mean, you are trying to reduce sentences because of the fact that it's African Americans and Latinos are in there. what about like, some of the arguments that I've heard from people is like, well, they did the crime, they should be in jail. What if we, you know, try to get more of the white people that did these crimes getting the same sentences, and then people would, you know, is there any kind of
won't
attempt to
happen.
look at that way?
It won't happen. It hasn't happened since the Nixon era. It will not happen.
Okay.
You know, Bill Clinton inhaled, right, or didn't inhale? Did he go to prison? No. It just
Bush,
wasn't.
when did he ever go?
Right.
Well, all right, thank you once again, everybody, for coming down, and let's again show our appreciation for Judy.
Read The New Jim Crow, it's a great book.
Yeah, The New Jim Crow. And who's the author?
Michelle
Alexander.
Alexander.
Michelle Alexander.